In the United States, the debate between which sex education approach should be taught in school has been and is still an issue for 3 decades now. The real question in the 20th century is to determine which approach is the most appropriate and most effective to be taught to adolescents in schools. In this section, we will analyze the effects of both the abstinence and comprehensive approach. Among all the countries, the U.S. pregnancy and STD rates are among the highest, and despite the decline in the 20th century, it still remains the highest compared to other countries. The largest declines in the pregnancy rates from 1990 to 2009 among teenagers were aged 15 to 17 and had a decline of 53%, and 18 to 19-year-olds had a 37%.
I think in the States, they tend to be a lot more religious than we are. And so there are certain states where they're extremely Christian, in which case sometimes there's really, according to their religion, there is no other choice other than abstinence. Having said that, I don't think that's really realistic, because I think in the end, it is the parents' jobs to instill values in their children. But having said that, while parents and schools and governments might want children to go with abstinence, not all children will. And I think we need to give our children the tools to stay safe. Studies have shown that even when we make condoms and other contraceptives available, it doesn't promote more sex. It just allows for safer sex, for the sex that's actually occurring. And it's going to occur whether we want to recognize it or not. But I think the other thing too is when we look at media, the only choice seems to be have sex. Sex is good, sex is fun. We should have as much sex as possible. And we forget that abstinence is a real choice. And it's a good choice, especially when we're not emotionally ready to deal with all the baggage that comes with having sex.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
I'm not sure in the Catholic system. In the Catholic system, do they not teach or preach abstinence?
Yeah. Yeah.
As the core of their curriculum?
Yeah, but in the U.S., some schools offer
I think because perhaps the reality of it is adults can say what they want and try and teach and preach to kids, but some kids will experiment, and you want to make sure that if they're going to experiment, that they are prepared and are going to be healthy as a result of that.
Yes, because I think the lack of education is what, when they do get older, they aren't aware of it, and then they get into situations where they don't know the consequences to them, and that is a big problem. I think there's a population of both that have been in both situations, but they haven't gotten to the point to teach them the appropriate method onto how to approach the situation, that they just kind of stop it before it happens and just don't work they don't help the students in the situation.
So again, it's the lack of education.
Yeah. The less they know, I guess what they're hoping is they won't want to know.
Yeah.
In an effort to reduce these rates, the U.S. government has funded abstinence-only sex education programs for more than a decade. The purpose of these programs is to delay sexual activity until marriage, and under the federal funding regulations, most of these programs cannot include information about contraception or safe sex practices. Proponents argue that this has led to a decline over the years. Pregnancy rates in 2009 were 102.1 per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44, the lowest level in 12 years. However, U.S. still remains the highest in terms of STDs and pregnancies of any industrialized country. Critics argue that denying students information about contraceptions and protections put them at risk, and that teaching abstinence is unrealistic because sex is a natural, normal part of life. So, which approach is the most effective and most appropriate to be taught to students? Let's examine the two approaches, the abstinence-only versus comprehensive sex education programs. The abstinence programs teaches that sex outside of marriage will have harmful social, psychological, and physical consequences. It omits controversial topics such as abortion, masturbation, and sexual orientation. It teaches condoms only in terms of failure rates. It provides no information on forms of contraception. The comprehensive programs teaches that sexuality is a natural, normal, healthy part of life. Abstinence from sexual intercourse is the most effective method of preventing unintended pregnancy and STDs. Includes topics such as human development, relationships, interpersonal skills, sexual expression, sexual health, and society and culture. Teaches that proper and consistent use of condoms can greatly reduce but does not eliminate the risk of unintended pregnancy. Researchers and critics say that abstinence only until marriage programs are ineffective. There's no evidence of increased rates of sexual abstinence, similar age of sex and numbers of sexual partners, rates of HIV infection and STDs are ineffective. Virginity pledges had a significantly higher STD and pregnancy rate than those who did not pledge. However, regarding the comprehensive programs, 2/3 of 48 states had positive behavior effects. It had delayed the initiation of sex, reduced the frequency of sex, reduced the number of new partners, reduced unprotected sex, and increased the use of contraception.
A new study says abstinence-only education programs don't work. So how would that possibly justify a $28 million increase in federal funding for these programs? A recent national study concluded that no evidence exists that abstinence programs delay the initiation of sex or reduce the number of sexual partners among teens. This comes on the heels of a long-awaited congressional report released in April that also found that teaching abstinence didn't decrease the likelihood that teens would have sex. So while those in Congress who know these programs don't work are using them as bait to trade with hardcore conservatives who would like them to work, the taxpayers are stuck with a nearly $200 million bill for it. Here now is Valerie Huber, Executive Director of the National Abstinence Education Association, and Rachel Maddow is still with us. All right, Rachel, let me start with you. I mean, it seems to me absurd that Democrats in Congress can't say we're going to cut it off. Instead, they're using this as bait and constantly saying, oh, you know, we'll trade you, we'll keep in the money for the abstinence-only programs.
Yeah, I'm hoping that this is a trick, because I understand why the Bush administration would ask for this money. They have pushed for this for a long time, and they have resisted all of the scientific evidence to the contrary, that this is a waste of money or maybe even harmful. But for the Democratic Congress to go along with it, I'm hoping there's something I don't understand about that, because otherwise there's no defending it.
All right, Valerie, look, I know you're going to tell me that you disagree with some of these new studies. Look, I believe the evidence is pretty clear that comprehensive sex education is probably more effective in reducing pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, etc. But let's even assume that there's a disagreement. Why do you think, then, that 14 states are refusing federal funding for abstinence-only programs?
Well, we know that that's a part of a coordinated plan by historic opponents of abstinence education, that through misinformation and misguided selective science regarding abstinence education, they are convincing governors that this is not a good plan.
So the congressional study wasn't true?
We know that there are a number of reports that show that abstinence education is effective.
But abstinence only talks about the failure rate of condoms. Now let's put up this number 7 here. 34% of U.S. teens have premarital sex by the age of 20. 58% of teens have had sex before the age of 18. 14% of teens reported having sex with 4 or more people. How do you deal? I mean, I know your argument would be we want to reduce the number from 58% before the age of 18. But now let's deal with the reality, and that is that 58% of them are having sex before the age of 18. I guess that the position of abstinence only is to just go like this and say, oh, please tell me they're not going to do it. I hope they don't do it.
No, the reality is that teens are resonating with the message of abstinence education in increasing numbers. There's trends data to show that more and more teens are abstaining.
But that's not what the studies show. You're losing on the studies.
No, that's not.
I mean, you are.
No, that's not true. In fact, a recent study just released showed
From who?
that Virginia.
From who? Before you tell me what the study is, who did the study?
Virginia's abstinence education program.
All right, yeah.
State of Virginia.
Right.
And actually showed that teens engaged in an abstinence education program were half as likely to
Virginia,
initiate
one of the
abstinence
states that's refused federal funding. If
Whenever
I'm
I evaluate myself, I turn out to be doing awesome as well. So
Actually,
that's hard.
I think
it's
an
important
independent
to listen.
research.
There was a congressionally mandated study that looked at abstinence programs over 10 years on a national level, and it was the results of that study that told us that abstinence-only education does not work to delay or stop teens from having sex before they get married. They just don't work. And so if abstinence doesn't work, it's a waste of money. If abstinence programs are being used to substitute for programs that actually give people usable information about contraception, STDs, and HIV, then they are killing people. They're not just expensive.
Valerie, you get the
deadly.
final word on this.
Teens
Say this, $200 million, whatever you think of this, ladies and gentlemen, there's at the very least controversy. $200 million for a program that is at the very least controversial doesn't seem to me to be a very good use of taxpayer dollars. But Valerie Huber, Rachel Maddow, thanks a lot.
Research states that parents want school curriculums to provide their children with knowledge on relationships, sexual health, and contraceptions. Society believes that it is the parents' responsibility to teach their children about sexuality and the changes in their body, but most schools find that parents cannot provide sufficient information on sex education, and/or some parents find it uncomfortable talking about sex with their children.
I do believe that children need to learn it from somewhere, and it is far better for them to learn it in the classroom than it is for them to learn from their friends or on the streets, because that information could be inaccurate. So yes, I do believe sex education, as appropriate for the age, is necessary.
Yes, to a point. I think it's the parents' job to teach the kids about sex education, but I also respect the fact that some parents don't go anywhere near that. My parents never talked with us about that at all. So whatever we didn't get in history, in phys ed class or health class, we had to figure out on our own. So as a matter of fact, my wife and I are kind of pre-stepping the school curriculum, because it seems to me they're pushing the sex education earlier and earlier. So we picked up some books from the library to support that for our youngest daughter.
Although the U.S. remains a country with the highest pregnancy and STD rates, over the centuries this number has been declining. Whether it is due to the increase of contraception use or through the funding of the abstinence-only programs, researchers and critics are still debating over which approach should be used to prevent these numbers from increasing. As of now, schools are free to choose any approach to teach sex education to students.